Okay, class, in this video, we're going to talk about users and groups. But before we can do that, I need for us to set up our DFS so I have something to demonstrate how to use users and groups and set permissions and things like that. So the first thing we're going to do is configure our DFS1 and DFS2. DFS1 is 0.6 and DFS2 is 8.3. Excuse me, 8.4. So I have everything all booted up. All my times are synchronized. I'm going to sign into DFS1 and DFS2. While that's signing in, I'm going to jump over to DFS2. I'm going to go back to DFS1. I'm going to use PowerShell. I'm just waiting for tab complete to work. Okay. And we're using 0.6/21. Our gateway is 172.16.0.1 and the interface alias is Ethernet. Set our DNS servers up, and we are going to use 0.2 and 0.3 as our DNS servers, these two boxes. This DFS server is going to be joined to the parent domain, not to the child domain or the tree domain. So I'm going to use the DNS servers on the parent domain. And the interface alias is Ethernet. I'm going to add it to the domain. This will be DFS1. The domain credentials are the domain name is Contoso. I'm going to restart. Let me just verify I can connect to the server. I can, so I'm not sure why I can't join. I'm going to pause this while I figure out what the issue is. I can resolve the name, but for some reason I can't join the domain. Okay, I found my mistake. In DFS1, I'm trying to use 0.6, but I use that on tree DC6. So I'm going to change this to the IP that it's supposed to be. It's running very slow right now. I chose a bad time to record. I'm gonna pause this while I'm waiting for this to open up. Okay, it's opened up. So according to our map, DC6 should be 0.5. So when I change that IP, I also have to change our conditional forwarder in DC1. So I opened up DNS. I went down to conditional forwarders. I'm going to right click and go right click a datum, go properties, highlight this, choose edit. I'm going to change this to 0.5. Click in the white space. So now I have that mistake backed out. I'm going to go to DFS1. I'm going to go back to see that error. It crashed. The graphic console crashed. No big deal. So I'm just click OK. Go to DFS1. Going to go into my network card. This is painful. See how it says multiple IP addresses? Because the IP that I tried to use is a duplicate. I was using it on DC6. So what it did was it kept that IP address, labeled it duplicate, and it gave myself an APIPA address. So that's why I have multiple addresses. So when you get that duplicate address, you just need to find the machine where that IP is being used. And I took a shot in the dark because I was thinking the mistake I probably made was DC6 given an IP of 6. And I was correct. Okay, it's going to be easier to do in PowerShell. So I'm going to disable it, re-enable it, and run IP config again. And make sure I don't have a duplicate address. And I don't. So now I'm going to try to rejoin. The other thing you can do is if you don't want to do that swap, just use .5 here for the IP address, and that will work. Okay, I'm going to pause this again while I'm waiting for it to reboot. It's rebooting now. Okay, it's rebooted, so I'm going to log in as the domain admin. It took like 2 minutes to reboot. I'm going to click Other User. And while that's logging in, I'm going to go to DFS2. I'm just going to do this one graphically. And this IP should be 8.4. 8.1 is my gateway, and we're going to use 8.2 and 8.3 as our DNS servers because those are part of the parent domain and they're on the east site. Now I'm going to rename DFS2, and the domain is contoso.com. It found the domain. Now it's going to reboot. So while that's rebooting, I'm going to go back to DFS1 and install the software. It's still coming up. Okay, it's fully loaded. So the first thing I'm going to do, and I do this for all my, maybe it's not fully loaded. I'm going to do for all my DFS servers is I'm going to add DFS2 to this server manager. The problem is I'm going to pause the video again. I'm going to wait like 15 minutes because I need to replicate, because when I joined this to the domain, it joined either DC3 or DC4. So I need to wait till that information gets replicated over to DC1. Because when I query Active Directory, I'm probably querying one of these two DNS or one of these two DCs, but it hasn't been replicated over to 1 or 2 yet. So I have to wait for the information from 3 or 4 to get replicated to 1 and 2. So I'm just going to pause the video, give it like 15 minutes and come back. Okay, I gave it a few minutes and tested it. So when I go to add servers now and click on find now, I could type in the name, but I don't have that many servers. So I just do find now to see all the servers. I'm going to add 1 and 2. One's already there, but I still add it. I still have to wait a few minutes. I'm going to try to go ahead and see if it still works. I'm going to go to manage, create a server group. I'm going to add 1 and 2. Click OK. I forgot to put in the name, Dfs servers. Again, we have to wait for the name for the DNS to get replicated because right now so for some reason I still can't communicate with DC4. Excuse me, DFS2. I'm going to pause it while it's loading up. I'm going to open up PowerShell. I'm just doing this so it's easier to read on the video. Just trying to see where it fails pinging. What I'm doing is from here, I'm pinging here, then here, then here, then here, then here. This is on the other side of the WAN link. This is over on the west. I can ping DC1, DC2, and I'm going to try. Something's wrong with one of these two DFS servers, and I don't know what. It just might be a firewall issue. I'm going to open up file and print sharing echo request on both machines. I shouldn't have to do this. The fact that it joined the domain, it should have the domain firewall rules, and that should be automatically opened. So I think because my network is running so slow, I don't have all the policies yet. So while I'm waiting for everything to get caught up, I'm just going to manually open the ICMP. Inbound and outbound, file and print sharing echo request. Let's see if I can ping now. And I can. So I do have communication between DFS1 and DFS2. I kind of felt it was the firewall rule because I was actually able to log in. I'm on DFS1, and under DFS servers, I can see that I was actually connected to that other machine. So I knew it was a firewall as soon as I came back to the screen. So the next thing I'm going to do is install the DFS software. I'm going to do it on DFS1, expand file and storage services, file and iSCSI services. I'm going to do DFS namespace and DFS replication. Unlike the last class, I'm going to put my DFS shares and my DFS root on the same box. So I'm going to click install. Now I'm going to do DFS on the other side as well. File and storage services, file and iSCSI services, namespace, and replication. Restart if needed. So while that's installing on both machines, I'm going to pause. Okay, DFS is done installing on DFS2, so I'm going to go jump over to 1, and it's done installing on DFS1. So now I'm going to configure my DFS. I'm going to create a new namespace, and my first server is dfs1 contoso.com. I'm just going to use their example. Our namespace will be public, and it's going to be a domain-based namespace. Now I'm going to highlight the namespace, and right now I only have one name server. So if this server goes down, people won't be able to get to these shares. So I'm going to add another namespace server, dfs2.contoso.com. Click OK. So these two machines are both going to host our namespace and our shares. If you get an error at this point, that means you probably didn't install the software on DFS2 or gave it enough time to replicate across the WAN link between that one and that two. So now I'm going to add a share. I'm going to add a new folder. I'm going to call it data. The first server is DFS1 data. For my SMB path, I always make everything lowercase. It doesn't exist, so it's going to create it. Now the local path will be shares, uppercase, data. I'm going to customize the permission. This is just the share permissions. I'm not going to use them. So I'm going to do everyone full control. The local folder doesn't exist, so I'm going to create it. So I'm going to add another target. So when they click on data, it'll take them either to DFS1 or DFS2. DFS2 data, all lowercase, and the local path will be shares. This will be the local path on DFS2 data, uppercase. So the network path, lowercase, the local path, uppercase. Essentially turning off share permissions by giving everyone full. We're going to lock it down with NTFS permissions or security permissions, whatever name you use. That's going to be part of this lesson. Our goal right now is to play around with those security permissions. We want users from any domain to be able to access this resource in the parent domain. So we're going to do that with groups. So that's what this lesson is about. I need this share up and running for us to do that lesson. Now it's going to ask us to create a replication group to replicate between the two shares, DFS1 data and DFS2 data. We don't have to replicate the namespaces or set up replication for that. That's automatic. This is only for the folder data. The namespace replication, you don't have to configure. It's automatically done for you. I'm just going to walk through the wizard. They're both blank, so I don't care who's my primary. In real life, if you had one server that was populated with data, you would make that your primary. It doesn't really matter. There's only 2 nodes. We're going to allow full bandwidth. Create. Okay, so now I'm going to close this out, go to DC1. I'm going to go to Tools, Group Policy Management. I'm going to expand my domain, expand Group Policy Objects. I'm going to right click, say New. I'm going to call it DFS Share. So now I'm going to edit that policy. Shares are mounted to users, not to computers. So I'm going to drill down to User Configuration, Policies, and Shared Folders. No, I'm not. Okay, scratch that. I'm going to go to User Configuration, Preferences, Drive Maps. I'm going to create a new map drive. I want to create contoso.com public data. I'm going to reconnect every time they log in. I'm going to label it as data. I'm going to give it a drive letter of S for share. Try to avoid lower drive letters. Click OK. Close. And now I'm going to link this to Contoso. So I'm going to right click, link an existing GPO, the DFS share. Now here's the problem. This is only going to affect any user in parent DC1 or parent DC2. So I want to give that shared drive to all my users. So I'm going to, regardless of what domain they're in, whether in their child domain or the tree domain or the parent domain. So I'm going to highlight domains and say show domains. Because I'm the enterprise admin, not just a domain admin, so I can manipulate all my domains if I could click it. I'll try this again. Okay, I'm going to sign into my child DC. I'm not sure why I can't connect to it. I'm going to go to Group Policy Management. I'm going to link an existing GPO. So instead of doing this from the parent DC, I'm just going to do it from the child DC. So I'm going to link an existing GPO. That GPO doesn't exist in the child domain. So I'm going to go up to the parent domain to find the GPO, choose it, and click OK. So I don't want to have to create the group policy 3 different times on 3 different domains. If I create it on one domain, I should be able to access that GPO on other domains. So I'm going to do the same for the tree domain. Go to Tools, Group Policy Management, highlight my domain, and link an existing GPO. I'm going to look in the Contoso domain, find the DFS share, and click OK. I'm going to do GP update. Now it's going to take at least 15 minutes to get over to the west side, to the east side. Okay, so now I'm going to open up my File Explorer. I don't have it just yet. So I'm going to try to first see if I can get to the share. I need to give it more time. So I'm just going to look at one other thing before I pause this video. I'm going to try to show my domains on the parent DC again. No, it's not working. I can reach data, but not the child. I'm gonna look at my child DC, the DNS. I know why. Yeah, I just can't resolve the name yet. So I just have to give it some time. I'm just going to leave it set because I see there's a record dc5.child.contoso.com. I just need to be patient and just sit back for a little bit. The network is really running slowly, and I think that's 90% of my problem. No, I found the problem. I have the wrong IP. This should be 0.4. Sorry, let me go back out of that. Go to our delegation, child, double click on the delegation, edit, and make this a .4. So apparently I made this .6 and this .5. So I need to change this to .4, how it belongs. I'm going to go to my child DC. It's already .5. I mean, it's already .4. So I'm going to try this again. I'm actually able to resolve the name. I can resolve the name there. I could already resolve the name for datum. I'm going to try to connect to child again. I'm going to show the child domain. I'm on group policy management. Right click, show domains. I'm going to try to choose a datum now. Click OK. So the problem existed because in my delegation, I had 0.4. I'm not sure what the problem was for a datum, but it just started working on its own. So that was my problem for the child. So in group policy management, I can see all three domains now. If I wanted to link a GPO, I can do that. I don't need to go to each DC to manage their group policies. I can do it from one console. We can also apply policies to sites. I got to right click, show sites, and I can show both sites as well. So if I linked a policy to this site, West site, it would apply to all the users on this site, regardless of what domain they're in. If I apply a policy to this site, it would affect all the users in this site, regardless of the domain that they're in. So again, the site is just a container that I can link a policy to. Okay, so I'm going to pause this video because we're about to do our live session. Uh, I imagine I just confused probably 90% of you. I had two problems. I had the wrong IP on DC6. I changed that to 2.5, I mean 0.5. I also went to the parent DC, went to DNS, and fixed the conditional forwarders to point to 2.5. The other issue I had was for my child domain, for the delegation, double click this and point this to 0.4. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video until after our live session. Okay, class, we're going to start creating some user accounts. What I did was I put a script up on GitHub, and I want you to download it onto your Windows box on DC1. So I'm going to go to DC1. I'm going to sign in. The easiest way for me to have you get this script is put it on GitHub. So this is one long line. This is not broken up into two lines. I didn't press enter here. So instead of having you use a browser to download a script, I can have you do something called an Invoke Web Request. And that will go to that URL, grab that file, and save it in this file. And so it's going to be saved inside. I was thinking of having you do it in PowerShell, but I mean inside of Internet Explorer, but I figured some of you might have problems because Internet Explorer isn't that supported anymore. So you can use Internet Explorer. You can navigate to this location and copy that and put it into a file. So once you run this command, this will be where it's saved. So I want you to go to C drive, users, administrator. When you download a PowerShell script off the internet, Windows won't trust it. So you need to right click, go to properties, and unblock that script. You'll see a little unblock button right here. I've already unblocked it. Once you've unblocked it, then I want you to right click it, then go edit. And this is the script. Um, Now I originally wrote this script to be run from the Windows host machine in the classroom. So right now it's really not going to work the way I want you to do it. So what I want you to do is highlight lines 5 and 6 and get rid of them. Then get rid of the last line. Now it's ready to run. The reason why I wanted to show you the script is up until this point, you would do a command new AD user dash, and you would have a name field or whatever field. Um, it's like laggy. You'd have all these fields that you would type out. And so what I'm doing is I'm showing you a different way to do it. So I'm creating something like an array. So I'm saying I'm assigning a variable. Let me first explain what this is. This is encrypting my password and saving it in a variable. This is defining my user account name. This right here is creating an authentication object. It's taking my user account name and my password and storing it and then creating an authentication object or a credential object and saving it in that variable. Then I'm creating an array. I'm taking a variable and I'm putting at squiggly bracket and a squiggly bracket down here. So instead of you typing hyphen enable, hyphen change, hyphen username, hyphen name, hyphen given name, I'm storing it all in one variable called $U1 attributes. And all this is stored in that one variable. Then I create another variable for U2 with all those attributes. Then I created a third variable called U3 attributes and store all those attributes in it. And so on for U4. And then I can type new AD user, then pass in that array. When I set the variable up here, I put $U4 attributes, then at symbol, then squiggly brackets to denote the block. But when I use it, I do at symbol, then the variable name. So what this will do is create 4 user accounts with all those attributes, create a new group, then add those users to the group. So save your script after you remove that information and press play. Now if I go to Active Directory users and computers, I can see I have user 1, user 2, user 3, user 4, and then I have a group called test users. And the members are all 4 users. So instead of typing out a command like say new AD user dash name user 1 dash enable true dash user principal and having one big long command, what you can do is, and this will work for any PowerShell command, you can create an array, create a variable equals at symbol, and then for each thing you would put a hyphen after in the command, you would just list it like that. End your block. So this goes from here to here. And then when you run the command, you can just pass that array to the command. And at that point, it will run all those, it would run that command with all those attributes. Different way of looking for things. This is pretty good because I could, if I wanted to, do a group and then do a loop and pass this in as a loop. But for right now, I'm just trying to keep it relatively simple. So this is using an array, Here I'm creating a group, a global group, a security group as opposed to a distribution, giving it a name, and indicating where it's going to be in the domain. That's the path. So basically, under contoso.com, I have a container called user. Create that group in that user container. That's called a distinguished name format. It's the path of where something's going to be stored. I didn't have to do it up here because it's the default location for users, so I didn't really have to supply the distinguished name. But that's going to be my user account name, description. The display name will be user for, first name, last name, where they work, their office that they're in, their job title, their city that they're in, and I'm also supplying my password. Again, it has to be encrypted. So play around with that script. If you want to play with for each group, you can do that as well. I can go over that if someone really wants to play around with doing a PowerShell loop. But I just wanted to give you one example of a PowerShell command to add user accounts. The book goes over some other methods that I think are antiquated, and I don't think they really cover user accounts real well. And since I was going to do another command, I figured, well, might as well not put it in, might as well put it in an array. So play around with that. That's kind of interesting. Um, let's talk about how to make a normal user account, just the old school method. So I could go to Tools, Users and Computers. I could right click the computer, the user container, say new users, and then put in a user account. Put in my login, U5. Type in the password. And for security purposes, you never want to know your user's password, so you're going to force them to change it the very next time they log in, the very first time they log in. The second option right here, users cannot change the password. You only want to do that if it's like a kiosk account. So if you had some sort of kiosk in your building and you don't want, and you had like a vague user account that people use to read email or something, that at that point you don't want anyone to be able to change the password. Guys, never check this. A PCI compliance. PCI stands for Payment Card Industry. If you accept payment through credit cards, your bank is going to force you to be compliant. It's called PCI compliance. You have to have a third-party company prove that you're compliant, and they'll attack you and do a bunch of things to your network to make sure you're secure. If you have any passwords that are non-expiring, especially your domain admins, because I've seen a lot of domain admins have their password as non-expiring, then you won't be PCI compliance. So don't ever do this. The last thing we can do here is account is disabled. I prefer to disable accounts, not delete them. Sometimes for uh, certain industries, like if you work for the government, you might have to keep that account for 7 years. That's the school's policy because we're a state organization. So you might not be allowed to delete it. But if you do delete an account and they've encrypted some data with their account, when you recreate that account, it'll be a different account because it doesn't go by the name, it goes by this GUID, 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 Global Unique ID. It'll be a different GUID, so it's essentially a different account, even though the name is the same. So you're going to have to decrypt that manually using a recovery key, which is a long process. If you disable an account and don't delete it, if they've encrypted something, you can always re-enable the account, sign in with their password, and just use the keys that they've already created. So it's always better to disable account, at least for a little bit, before you delete an account if an employee is no longer with the company. Click Next, then Finish. If I go to that account, I can go into the Member tab, add users to different groups. I can specify whether they're allowed in to dial in remotely using some sort of VPN, or I can control that through an MPS, which is better. I can set up environmental variables for that person. I can define their sessions when they connect using remote desktop, general information, addresses, account information. Guys, when we went through the wizard, those items right here are the items in the wizard are right here. So you can check or uncheck one of those items. You never want to store the password using a reversible encryption unless you're trying to do something you probably shouldn't do. Like back in the day, if you had a Linux box, you might need to enable this so you can use the password on a Linux box. Not smart. Um, you can expire the account. You can define when they're allowed to log in. Maybe they're an employee that you only want to allow them to log in during work hours, for security reasons, things like that. If they type their password in too many times and it locks their account, you can unlock it here, or you can unlock it here if their account was locked. It's not locked for me. You can set up the roaming profiles. We already did that in the last class. If they had a home folder back in Windows NT days, we use this a lot. Not really relevant anymore. Telephone numbers allow people to do remote desktop. So if tech support needed to connect to your machine remotely, you're going to allow that, but you're going to make the user click yes so they're aware that someone's connecting remotely. I've seen scenarios where actual techs were monitoring employees without the employee knowing it, uh, which is not cool. Uh, you can't violate someone's right to privacy. Remote desktop profile, if you wanted to configure something like that, I have no clue what this is. So I'm going to cancel that. So that's how you create an account old school. And there's all kind of other accounts in here that they want you to be aware of. I'm not going to go into them. You can read that in the book. The last thing I want to show you about user accounts is go to manage, no, go to tools and do this Active Directory Administrative Center. You see how this is it's essentially a web browser, the server manager. So when I run this, it's running something called an MMC console. If I go to Task Manager, I can see MMC, Microsoft Management Console. And you have this consistency, two or three panes, and you can create custom ones if you wanted to. I could do mmc.exe. I'm not sure why that's not opening. I'm just going to do it here, mmc.exe. So you have this blank console. You can add these little snap-ins. Let's say you want one for Active Directory. You want one for DNS. Now listen, if I didn't install the management tool for DNS, this wouldn't be here. Um, I could have one for Group Policy Manager. I could add all those to one console. Then I could do File, Save As. I'm going to save it to my desktop as Console 1. So when I go to my desktop, I can have all the tools that I normally use in one console. But Microsoft is trying to get away with this console for new services. They're going to this new, I want to say it's a browser. Essentially, that's what it is. It's really a browser. Everything is coded in HTML or some derivative of HTML. So they have a new, essentially, users and computers already built for you called Active Directory Administrative Center. So it's very similar to our server manager, but it's just like our domain. So I have a user container. There's my domain computers. There's my domain controllers. I can right click and say new user group or computer. If I highlight this right here, uh, the right click is right here. If I didn't want to have to right click, the right click of that object, the right click of this object is right here. So if you're in a touchpad or something where you don't have a right click, you can just highlight it and use this side menu. So I could say new user and things like that. Another thing I want to point out. So I'm going to go back to here. So if I right click and delete If I had an OU here with users in it, and I'll go into what an OU is. It's just another container. And I delete the OU, it would delete all the users. And if there was 4,000 user accounts, you just deleted 4,000 user accounts. If you try to recreate them, they're essentially going to be different user accounts, even though it's the same name. At that point, all the permissions will need to be reconfigured on everything across the entire network. So if you delete a user account, you either have to restore from a backup and do this something called Active Directory restore, or you're going to have to manually recreate the users. In either case, it's not a fun experience. So Microsoft has this new feature that came out in 2008, I believe, called a recycle bin for Active Directory objects. If you enable this, you can't disable it later. It's a one-way enable. So it's here for good. So if I right click, if I click that, it's saying it can't be disabled. So it's going to take a minute to replicate throughout the entire forest. So this is not for one domain, this is the entire forest. So once you've enabled it rather, I'm going to highlight this and hit refresh. You have a new container called deleted objects. I'm going to go to Active Directory users and computers. I'm going to highlight my domain, go to view, then advanced features. You can't see it here at all. There's no way to see it in this old console. So it's only available in here. So if I delete a user account, I don't care where I delete it from, whether I delete it from here, if I go to the user container. So if I delete 5 here, and delete 2, in the past, they'd be deleted. Now they're not deleted. If I go back to my domain, I've deleted objects. I can restore those deleted objects. Highlight it and restore. That's a nice feature. But if you come into the here and delete it, if you go into deleted objects and delete that object, it's going for good. So you don't want to let your deleted objects get too full and use up a lot of disk space. So you do have that ability to permanently delete, but they're going to go into this folder first. I think that's a really nice feature. I can't imagine having a domain without it. So I'm going to go to users. I'm going to create a new user. So this is the nice thing about this feature. Before, if I wanted to do things to my user account, I had to create the user account, right click it, and modify it. Now I can do this all right from the get-go. So let's say I have these sections here. One called direct associated password settings, one called profile settings, one called authentication silo, authentication policy silo. If I don't use all those sections all the time, I don't want to view them. So let's just say I don't use those. So I can only look at the squares of things I use the most. So I'm going to put a user 6, U6. I can type in my password. I'm going to prevent it from being accidentally deleted. I'll show you this. If you don't want them to have to change the password the first time, just choose this. Don't check anything underneath it. They won't have they won't have to change your password. I could put all this information. I can add them to a group. I had a group called test users. It took a minute to find it. I use my script to create that. I can modify the profile if I wanted to. I can do this all from this one screen. I don't need to go to a bunch of different screens. So you can create that user account and configure everything from this one screen. So I'm going to click OK. So I just created that user account. Here's the other nice thing. When it creates a user account, all it's really doing is running PowerShell in the background. So if I expand this, I can see the PowerShell that it used. If I select everything, copy, I could go to Windows ISE, Integrated Scripting Environment. I want to paste it up here. When I did a script, I did it relatively simply. This was deleting those objects, so that wasn't part of my last thing I did. This is the part for creating all that new user account. I did a abbreviated method of this, but what you can do is it can give you an idea how to create user accounts. Or you can replace these with variable names so you can create your own little Python, excuse me, not Python, PowerShell script and, create a script to do user accounts. You'll create user accounts a lot. And here's the thing. Most user accounts can fit into a role. Like we have a professor role, we have a student role, we have an adjunct role. If you work for a corporation, you might have engineers, you might have techs, you might have salespeople, you might have HR people. So when you do something for an HR person, you're going to do that for all HR people, meaning you're going to create a user account, add them to certain groups, give them access to certain shares, um, uh, give them certain shared folders that they need, set the roaming profile up in a certain location, and you need to be consistent. If you manually create user accounts all the time and you don't do it with the script, you're going to forget something. And invariably that user is going to go away and come back or generate a help desk ticket. So to avoid users going away, then coming back and have you correct something is to create a script using PowerShell. So if it's a certain type of user, that script will do all the things that you normally do for those type of users. So I highly recommend you playing around with the PowerShell script when you get to a corporation and setting it up to create user accounts for you. Because to do it manually every single time, create shared folders, add them to groups, it's just going to get too tedious and invariably you're going to forget something. So a little more PowerShell, and we're getting this all from this administrative center. It's a pretty nice utility. I don't use it as much as I should just because I'm kind of old school. I go to my default method that I've been using for years. But you guys are just starting out, so I would get used to these utilities and having these the default utilities that you go to instead of going the old school method of Active Directory users of computers. Go to this administrative center. This is probably, if you're on help desk resetting passwords and things like this is probably where you'll spend most of your days. Look, if I highlight the domain, sorry, if I highlight the overview, they have this. I'm going to close this out. Well, actually, I'm going to leave it open in case you want to read it. But if you wanted to reset a user account or unlock their password, I don't need to find it. I could just put it in here, hit apply, and you're good to go. If you want to search for a user account, you can do it right from here. You don't need to go and drill down through all the objects. It's a nice utility. Play around with it. Okay, I'm going to pause the video before we move on to groups, which is a very important topic. Okay, class, I wasn't able to finish the video last night because I felt really to do this lesson right, I really needed a diagram. So let me pull up my DC. When I create a new group, I have the ability to change the group scope from domain local, global, and universal, and the group type to security or distribution. The only time you use distribution is when you're dealing with an email server. So for all intents purposes, in regards to security permissions, we're going to be always using security. In regards to this class as a whole, we're going to be using security as a group type. So I want to explain the different purposes of this domain local, global, and universal. So I have this diagram, and this is going to be part of the notes. What can be a member of a universal group? So if you have a universal group, I can make a member can be any universal group from any domain, a global group from any domain, and a user from any domain. So it sounds like it has flexibility, but there's one caveat for this type of group. The group membership is stored in a global catalog. So you're going to be creating additional replication that you normally wouldn't use if you didn't have uh, if you didn't use universal groups. It's always best to avoid universal groups. Back in 2003, if you had a universal group with 4,000 members, basically every time you make a change to one of those members, you would do a full update of that universal group. In 2008 and later, we can now do something called incremental updates where you only update the change, but it adds a lot of replication traffic to your forest. So it's best to avoid them. What can be a member of a global group? A global group can have global groups from the same domain and users from the same domain. Then we have a domain local group. A domain local group can have universal groups from any domain, global groups from any domain local groups from its own domain, and users from any domain. So those are the rules, but what does that really mean? And how would you use them? So we have our forest with a root domain and two child domains. This child domain starts a new tree. if I could get this to work right. Okay, so we have our DFS infrastructure that we just set up. That's going to be in contoso.com. So here's how you use the groups. So I'm going to create a group called Contoso Resource Access Domain Local. So basically, I'm going to grant modifier rights to this group for our share in our DFS. And then each domain in the Contoso, the child, and the datum, I'm going to create 3 global groups, one in Contoso, one in child, one in datum. And then I'm going to put my users from Contoso into the Contoso users global group. The users from the child domain will be going to child user global group, and then the users from datum into the datum user global group. Now, this could be Contoso cells, cells group, whatever. I'm just using a name to really explain what goes in it. And those 3 groups will be members of this domain local. So let's verify that it doesn't violate our rules. Can I put users from the same domain in global group? Yes. Can I put global groups from any domain in a domain local group? Yes. Am I avoiding using universal groups? Yes. So I'm going to create a group, a domain local group, in the same domain where the resource is located. And then I'm going to grant that group permissions to that resource. Share permissions, security permissions, NTFS permissions. And then I'm going to create global groups where my users are, one in each domain. Put my users in a global group. The global groups will be members of my domain local group, and the domain local group will have access to the resource. So basically, if a person in a datum, if the domain admin in a datum wants to grant permission to this share, he doesn't need to call the domain admin from Contoso or have him do it. All that admin needs to do in a datum is add his users to his global group that he controls. That global group is then nested inside the domain local group, and that domain local group will have modifier rights to that share. So Greg in this group will have modified permissions to that share. Tim is in this group. He would have um, modified permissions to this share. Tim is in this group is in this group is granted permissions. So we're going to grant permissions to domain local groups, but put our users in global groups. So let's go through and do that. I'm going to move this off to the side. So I'm going to go to my parent DC. I'm going to create a global group called Contoso Resource Access. In this case, the resource is going to be my DFS share we created earlier. If you only have one domain, stick to global groups. If you have multiple domains, do the group nesting with global groups and domain local groups. Assign permission to a resource to the domain local groups. The users go in the global groups. The global groups go in the domain local. Okay, so now I'm going to create if I move this to the side, and I made that the wrong group. Sorry, I'm just going to delete it. I don't think I can change it after the fact. Yeah, I can't change it. It's going to be a domain local group. Now I'm going to create a global group called Contoso User Global. And you can use any name you want. This could be your sales users, your engineering users, your text user. And then I'm going to create 3 user accounts. This isn't a real production environment, so I'm not going to force them to change their password. So I'm going to do Sally. And then I'm going to do Sam. So I'm going to highlight Bob, highlight Bob, hold down Control, highlight Sally, highlight Sam. Right click, add to group. All I'm going to do is type the part that is unique, Contoso user. So now if I right click Bob, I can see Bob is a member of Contoso user global and domain users. Every time I create a new user account, it's automatically added to domain users. So now I'm going to go to the child DC. I'm going to open up Active Directory users and computers. I'm going to create a new global group called Child Users Global. I'm going to create 3 users. Jane. Tim. And lastly, for the child domain, Alex. Now I'm going to do the tree domain. So each domain admin will have control over his own global group. Every time a new user needs permissions to the share, all you have to do is add the user to the global group. The global group will eventually be added to the domain local, and the domain local will get permissions to their share. So we don't really need to get the domain admin involved every single time. Let me see if this worked, incidentally. So I'm going to go to Tools, Active Directory Users and Computers. Going to create a new global group called Adatum Users Global. And I don't really need to put the word global in the group name. I'm just doing it just so we can see that it's a global group because it's right here as well. I forgot something on the child domain. I'm going to go back to the child domain. So I have these 3 users. I need to add them to the group. Holding down Control, add to group. I'm going to call it child. It's the only group name in this list that starts with child. And I can see Tim is now a member of Child Users Global. So I'm going back to my tree domain. So I'm going to create 3 users. I'm going to add those 3 users to that group, holding down Control. The only group name that starts with Adatum is my group that I'm referring to. And I can see Greg is a member of Adatum. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my parent. So this is where you need to be patient because we created some objects in other domains, so we need to wait till it gets replicated to the parent domain. So we might have to pause the video and let it set for a little bit. This video has taken me probably 5 hours to do just because I'm waiting for things to happen. You have to be patient with this video. So I'm going to go to Properties. Under Members, I'm going to add my global groups. So the first one is Contoso Users Global. That'll be easy because it's in the same domain. I'm going to press cancel. I named this wrong. It's Contoso Users, plural. And I can rename it here as well. There's such a lag here. So name it to Contoso Users Global. So I'm going back to my domain local group. Go to Properties. Under Members, I'm going to type Contoso Users. Then I'm going to add. Instead of looking in Contoso for the next group, I'm going to change location and look at my child domain called child.contoso.com. I'm going to do a search for child, and it was so it was able to add the global group. Now I'm going to do a datum. You see how a datum is its own tree, so it gets its own collapsible section. I did everything on the west side just to keep things going quickly. If you move over to DC3 or DC4 and create some of those users or groups, it's going to be a while before it gets over to the west side. So here's where, when you click OK, that'll let you know if everything worked well. Okay, so Sally is a member of this global group. That global group is a member of this domain local group. So now I'm going to go to my DFS. So I'm going to close this out. I'm going to go to File and Storage Services, Shares, and Fix the Permission. So for data on DFS1, I'm going to go to Properties, change my permissions, then customize them. The share permissions we already have fixed, everyone full. When we create the DFS shares, we have the ability to change this, but we don't have the ability to change the NTFS permissions. So what we're going to do is I'm going to remove the two users group, and I'm going to add my global group. Contoso, that's unique. So I'm just going to click OK. So Contoso resource domain local group will get modify rights. If you give someone full permission, they can change permission. That's the major difference between full control and modify. Modify, they can create and edit documents and folders inside the share, but they won't be able to change their permission. You give them full control, they'll also be able to change their permission. Click OK, click OK. I'm going to pause the video while this is working. Okay, it went through. I'm just going to right click and just double check that. I can see my permissions are correct. Now I don't really need to do it to DFS2 because eventually the permissions will get copied over from DFS1. So I could just give that a little bit of time. So to test that, I'm going to log out. I'm still in the DFS. I'm going to go to other user. I'm going to do a datum, Mary. First time Mary's logged in, so it's going to take a minute. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to open up the File Explorer. So Mary has the S drive. I'm just going to create a new document called Mary. So Mary can write to it. Now Mary is accessing a resource on the parent domain. She's even signed into a resource in the parent domain. I have no machines in the tree domain or child domain, so I have no place for Mary to sign into the domain itself. So that's why I'm using this machine. there's a trust relationship between all the domains. So a user account from one domain can sign in to a user account on another domain. So if I signed into the tree domain with the admin account from the child domain, the admin account will just be a normal user account in the tree domain. So I'm going to sign in as Alex in the child domain. Again, I'm still on DFS 1. I'm going to pause it while it's loading up. Open up the the File Explorer, go to the S drive, and Alex can create documents inside of the DFS share. So I'm going to sign out and sign in as a user from Contoso. I'm going to sign in as Sally. Now in this case, since DFS 1 belongs to the Contoso domain, I don't need to put Contoso. The only time I need to put Contoso on a machine that's in the Contoso domain is if I use the administrator account. Not an account that's in the administrative group, the actual name administrator. When I type that, it automatically defaults to the local machine, not the domain. I'll pause this for a moment. Open up the File Explorer. And Sally can write to that share. So guys, the main thing with group nesting is if you have multiple domains, you need to be able to nest global groups into domain local groups and grant access to the domain local group for a resource. And all your users go in a global group. If you're only one domain, just stick to global groups. Try to avoid universal groups because the group membership is stored in the global catalog, which I haven't discussed yet. That's going to be in another topic. But try to avoid universal groups at all cost. They're easy to work with, and you can get things working if you don't know what you're doing. Back in the day when I would do uh, admin stuff for third-party companies that I didn't work for, I just kind of supported other people's networks. If I went into a network and I saw universal groups, I knew that domain admin didn't know what he was doing, and at that point, I was going to have to really earn my money. So try to avoid those global groups. Over time, groups get out of control. Users quit. People don't delete their users. It's really hard to keep track of your groups. So if you try to keep everything nice and clean, let every domain admin manage his own global group, and never go into play around with that domain local group because that really should only have other groups in it. The only people that should be a member of this group that's granted permission is other global groups. I shouldn't open this up and see 400 user accounts. All the users should go in global groups. This is where my users should be. Now, I was going to do this, but some of you might have an issue with this. So I want to each domain to create the global groups, but I could have changed domains right here. without having to switch. So I'm on the DC1. I don't have to switch to the child domain to manage the child domain. Because remember, I'm signed in as an enterprise user, so I can do anything I want to any domain. So if I wanted to go to Active Directory users and computers for the child domain, I can just switch domains and it automatically connects me to DC5. So if I go and switch to the tree domain, it'll automatically connect me to DC6. But what if I wanted to stay in the parent domain but just work against another domain controller? I can do that as well. If I wanted to, I'm going to change back to Contoso. That's my only domain that has multiple domain controllers. And again, for my child domain in a real production environment, I would have multiple domain controllers and same for the tree domain. So I'm connected to Contoso. If I wanted to, I could work on DC3 or DC4. So if I go and jump to DC3 right now, I could see all my user accounts have replicated from DC1 all the way over to DC3 because I can see them here now. There's Sally, there's Sam, there's my groups that I just created. The other thing is I rebooted my DC6 and it got the group policy, so now I have the S drive. I don't know why it wasn't coming up before. Guys, I don't know why this uh, D drive is kind of mapped there, but um, so everything is working well. This lab is going to take time. Please be patient with it. It's a confusing lab, and then I made a lot of mistakes on top of it. So, you know, if you need help, text me. Okay, that's it. That's going to be it for this lab, and I will see you on the next lab session.